The 777 Autoflight system is similar to Autoflight systems on other Boeing airplanes. You control the system with the mode control panel and monitor its status on the PFD. The Autoflight system consists of the flight directors, the autothrottle, and 3 autopilots. You can use these separately or together. You can use the flight director and autothrottle for all phases of flight. You can use the autopilot for all phases of flight except takeoff. You can connect the Autoflight system to the FMC for a fully automated flight. There are, however, some new features on the 777. Let's learn the system by using the controls in a normal flight profile. Let's begin with pre-flight. Turn on a flight director. When turned on, flight director enunciates on the respective FMA. Takeoff go-around enunciates for roll mode and for pitch mode. Notice that flight director roll and pitch mode enunciations are also displayed on the other PFD. Now turn on the other flight director. Flight director now enunciates on this PFD. There are 2 autothrottle arm switches. One switch for the left thrust lever servo and one switch for the right servo. Arm the autothrottle. There is no enunciation for autothrottle armed. With 2 autothrottle servos, the autothrottle system positions each thrust lever independently from the other. Now, position the autopilot disengage bar to the up position. Set the bank limit selector to auto. In the auto position, the bank angle limit changes automatically depending on airspeed. Like other autopilots, the bank angle positions set a fixed bank angle limit independent of airspeed. The bank limit selector functions in the heading and track select modes only. It has no effect on LNAV. Next, set the altitude increment selector to auto. This is one of those new features that has been added to the 777. In auto, the selector is rate sensitive. Turning the selector fast will increment the altitude more than turning it slow. Altitude is changed in increments of 100 feet. A finer increment is available for setting the MDA. If the baro minimum is set on either PFD, you can set that value, round it up to the nearest 10-foot increment in the altitude window. For example, if the baro minimum is 1363, you can set 1370. In the 1,000-foot position, the altitude selector is not rate sensitive. The selector only changes the altitude in units of 1,000 feet. Your papers are on board and you have received your clearance. Now use the IAS Mach selector to set V2 of 142. This setting is used for initial command pitch attitude after takeoff. Verify the indication on the PFD. You plan to use LNAV and VNAV on this flight. LNAV and VNAV can be armed prior to takeoff. Arm LNAV and VNAV. Like other Autoflight systems, armed modes are enunciated white. Set your initial heading of 130. Set your initial altitude of 5,000 feet. Now let's look at the takeoff. You are cleared for takeoff. The takeoff go-around switches or toga switches are located on the thrust levers. You have advanced the thrust levers to 1.05 EPR. Push a toga switch. Pushing either toga switch engages the autothrottle. The thrust levers advance to the takeoff reference thrust. In this case, the second takeoff thrust D rate has been selected. At 80 knots, the autothrottle enunciation changes to hold. In hold, power is removed from the autothrottle. You can move the thrust levers without interference from the autothrottle. If the flight directors were not turned on and airplane speed is greater than 80 knots, you can push a toga switch to pop up the flight directors. If the flight directors were on and LNAV and VNAV were armed and airplane speed is greater than 80 knots, you can push a toga switch to disarm LNAV and VNAV. During the climb, the flight director commands a pitch to maintain the greater of V2 plus 15 or the airspeed at rotation plus 15. If this target speed is exceeded for more than 5 seconds, the target speed is adjusted to the new speed not to exceed V2 plus 25. The flight director commands roll to maintain track. At 50 feet, LNAV engages. At 400 feet, VNAV engages. Once airborne, you can cancel the thrust limit derate with a push of a toga switch. Cancel the derate. The thrust limit mode changes from takeoff to takeoff, and the autothrottle engages in thrust reference and sets full rated takeoff thrust. Now engage the autopilot. Autopilot enunciates on the FMA. Unlike other Boeing airplanes, where a single autopilot may be engaged, pushing an autopilot engage switch on the 777 engages the autopilot system. When reaching acceleration height, the FMC commands acceleration to 5 knots below flap placard speed. As flaps are retracted, the Autoflight system sets the next target airspeed. When you reach the thrust reduction altitude or flap setting set in the FMC, the autothrottle reduces thrust to the climb limit. If VNAV is not engaged, you can set climb thrust by engaging flight level change or by pushing the climb continuous thrust switch. Let's see how to accommodate an ATC temporary speed requirement without disengaging VNAV. First, push the IAS Mach selector. Notice the IAS Mach window unblanks, displaying the existing target airspeed. Next, change the target speed to 210 knots. Notice VNAV remains engaged. You have merely assumed temporary control of the airspeed from the FMC. Now return to the FMC climb speed by pushing the IAS Mach selector a second time. The IAS Mach window blanks and the target speed changes to the FMC speed. An altitude alert occurs when within 900 feet of the MCP altitude. A box appears around the selected altitude, and the box around the current altitude becomes bold. The display remains this way until within 200 feet of the MCP altitude. Within 200 feet of the MCP altitude, the displays return to normal. After level off, an altitude deviation alert occurs 200 feet away from the MCP altitude. The PFD altitude box changes to amber, along with the ICAS alert message, master caution and caution beeper. Return to within 200 feet of the selected altitude to clear the caution. You have received clearance to climb to flight level 250. For convenience, turn the altitude selector to the 1000 position. Select the new altitude and initiate the climb using flight level change. Thrust and flight level change speed enunciate on the PFD. The autothrottle sets thrust based on the required altitude change. The greater the altitude change, the greater the target vertical speed. Pitch holds the speed selected in the IAS Mach window. As you climb to your cruise altitude, let's briefly discuss the altitude hold switch. The altitude hold switch is used to initiate an immediate level off. If altitude hold is pushed, the airplane initiates a level off to the altitude where the hold switch was pushed. Let's go back to the climb. You are now approaching the MCP altitude of 25,000 feet. When approaching the MCP altitude automatically engages. The autothrottle engages in speed and now controls airspeed. After level off, the selected altitude is maintained and both the autothrottle and the pitch enunciations remain the same. Now that we're level, let's look at some controls that control the airplane's lateral flight path. First, use heading select. Turn left to a heading of 090. Heading select enunciates on the PFD. On initial engagement, the autopilot turns the shortest direction to the new heading. On the 777, you can also fly a selected ground track with the same controls. Simply change the heading select window to track select by pushing the heading track reference switch. Track is now displayed on the heading track window and the PFD. The selected heading bug changes to the selected track bug on the PFD and the ND, and the selected heading track reference changes to T. Notice that the ND display orientation remains heading. The heading track switch has no effect on the ND display orientation. Turn right to a track of 280. Since track select is already engaged, the airplane turns in the same direction as the selector knob is turned, even if it is the longer direction. Now let's look at the heading track hold switch. Pushing the heading track hold switch engages the heading hold or track hold mode. Engage the track hold mode. The current heading or track is maintained. If in a turn when the mode is engaged, the airplane first rolls wings level, then holds its current heading or track. Now let's return to our LNAV route. When the LNAV switch is pushed, LNAV engages if the airplane is within 2.5 miles of the active leg. If the airplane is greater than 2.5 miles from the active leg, LNAV arms, then engages when approaching the active leg. Arm LNAV. Now let's look at the speed controls. Use the IAS Mach reference switch to accelerate to 0.82 Mach. To switch back to indicated airspeed, push the IAS Mach reference switch a second time. The window now displays the indicated airspeed equivalent to 0.82 Mach. Now let's look at some of the autothrottle controls. There are two ways of disconnecting the autothrottle. You can position the autothrottle arm switches to the off position, or you can push an autothrottle disconnect switch. An autothrottle disconnect switch is located on each side of the thrust levers. Either switch disengages both servos. If disconnected by the autothrottle arm switches, the autothrottle is no longer armed. None of the autothrottle modes are available, nor is the autothrottle available for speed protection. If disconnected by the autothrottle disconnect switch, the auto throttle remains armed and is available for speed protection. Engaging flight level change, VNAV, or TOGA engages the auto throttle. Or by pushing the auto throttle engage switch, the auto throttle engages in the mode appropriate to the currently engaged pitch mode. Now disengage the auto throttle by using an auto throttle disconnect switch. Touch the highlighted area. Push the switch a second time to reset the master caution system and cancel the ICAS message. Now re-engage the auto throttle by pushing the auto throttle engage switch. The auto throttle engages in mode appropriate to the currently engaged pitch mode. In this case, since altitude is the engaged pitch mode, the auto throttle engages in the speed mode.